I don't know many series that switch up their art direction as often as The Legend of Zelda. While Mario games have had the same aesthetic since the GameCube for example, Zelda has a maximum of like 3 games with the same art direction before everything is switched up again. Today we are ranking all of them, main series as well as spin-offs. But 2 important things before we begin. Number 1, remakes, remasters and re-releases will be taken into consideration for each game, and number 2, the original Legend of Zelda on NES as well as Zelda 2 will not be included, because I don't think you can speak of an art style with those games. They were made as good as could be considering the severe limitations of the time. Ranking them in this list is pointless. So that leaves 14 entries, let's get to ranking them. And of course we begin with the worst one, which can only be the style of the 3 Zelda games released on the Philips CDI. I don't really want to waste too many words on it, because what can you say? Everyone can see this is hideous, every joke about it has been made over years, so let's just move on with actually interesting games. Up next, we find the titles with the questionable honor of being the Nintendo developed Zelda games with the worst art style. For me, that's Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. They both feature Link's toon style, as seen in Wind Waker. But while we'll see that game much higher on the list, this just doesn't look good on the Nintendo DS. Generally speaking, I've always found Nintendo DS games with 3D graphics and models to look kinda bad, and these games are no exceptions. I had that opinion when these games were new, but to make matters even worse, the art style also aged terribly. The cel-shaded graphics that look so amazing in Wind Waker fall incredibly flat with the low resolution of the DS, leading it to make a full 180 from charming to boring. It's a shame because this same art style on the 3DS may have found itself much higher on the list, but unfortunately it now has to rank near the bottom. Next on the list is our first spin-off, being Cadence of Hyrule. Released in 2019, it was developed by Brace Yourself Games and is a crossover with their successful indie game Crypt of the Necrodancer. You could say the same about its art style, which merges Zelda's general top-down look with the style of Crypt of the Necrodancer, which results in what I would say is a simply weaker version of the general Zelda style. It looks a bit too cheap, almost like a mobile game, and famous Zelda locations that appear in this game, like Kakariko Village or Hyrule Castle, have mostly looked much better in other entries. It's definitely not terrible and absolutely excusable considering an indie studio developed this, but it does put it below most other Zelda entries for me. One rank higher we find A Link Between Worlds and its little brother Triforce Heroes. Now, let me preface this by saying I love the concept art and artwork for A Link Between Worlds. It has a lovely hand-painted feel, which especially suits the new characters like Hilda or Yuga very well. I'm not a huge fan of Link and Zelda's design in this game, they're a tad too young for my liking, but that's not the reason why the 3DS games are so low. That's instead a similar problem to Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, a 3D focused art style which just doesn't fully deliver. While these two undoubtedly look better than the DS games, it still feels a bit unrefined and low quality. And that's in particular a problem with 3D games, as we can see with the next entry, which are the Oracle games, Ages and Seasons. Now, these two are hardly the peak of sprite-based designs, but the floor for sprites tends to be higher than 3D models for me, which is the reason why the Oracle games are higher than the 3DS games, despite not being as good from a graphical perspective. But this video is about art style, the art direction you take with the limitations of the system in mind. And the Oracle games simply do that much better than the games below them on the list. Simple, but colorful and bright, these games really put the color in Game Boy Color. It's nothing spectacular, it's even a little ugly by today's standards, so they're still quite low on the list, but these are the first games in the list I would give compliments for their art style. In the 9th spot of the list, we find the 2 games on Nintendo 64, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Now, if these games hadn't received their 3DS remakes, I probably would have excluded them from the list, as I think they have similar development stories as the original Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2. On the Nintendo 64, this was simply how you made games and how they looked. I'm not entirely sure if there's much of an art style to talk about with the originals. But the 3DS games changed that, so that's the one I'm ranking. Once again, these games suffer from a 3D style on a system that can't quite pull it off syndrome, but because these two go all in and use an actual 3D point of view as opposed to a top-down perspective, I think it works a bit better. That said, I do hope we will one day get these two remade on an actual modern console, because the art design deserves better than 2 underpowered 3D consoles. And should we eventually see that, I wouldn't be surprised if they very quickly shut out the list. but for now, it's place 9 for these two classics. Then we get to the 8th spot, where we find Twilight Princess. The story of this game's art style is an often told one, being a reaction to fans who wanted a realistic and mature art direction as was promised in the GameCube's original showcase. Now, I grew up in the 2000s, I love myself some darkness and edge, and while this game doesn't go full Shadow the Hedgehog, it does point Zelda more in that direction following the colorful Wind Waker. And while I originally really liked the look of this game back when it first came out, I don't think it has aged as well. The gritty earth tones simply do not have the same impact as it did in 2006, when this was new, cool and in demand. But now, almost 20 years later, I have seen this color scheme and realistic style in games so much, I can't get excited over it anymore, and much prefer the unique and colorful styles of other Zelda games. The HD version on Wii U did help make everything look a bit cleaner, but at the end of the day, the darker tones of Twilight Princess make it too muted for my liking. I will say though that I really like Zelda and Ganondorf's design from this game. They might still be my favorite to date even. Next in 7th place is another game in the same vein as the Oracle duo, as it's another one that pushed this limited system to its limits. I'm talking about A Link to the Past, which is what I would say one of the best looking games on the SNES. Many elements that would later become iconic features of the Zelda games debuted in this game, and the art style is no different. This entry birthed the look of the top-down games, and in my opinion did it better than some entries that followed. It may not be the most colorful game on the list, but it's still very vibrant and pleasant to the eyes, and the contrast with the Dark World is nicely done. An easy cop-out could have been to make the whole Dark World black and hard to see, but that's fortunately not the case at all. Next on the list we find Skyward Sword, which has an art style reminiscent of Twilight Princess, except a whole lot brighter. And as you might expect, that definitely boosts it a couple places for me, because it results in, especially the environments, looking much better. Skyloft is the prime example of this, it just looks fantastic. What stops Skyward Sword from a higher position, however, is its character design. Link looks alright, but Zelda and most original characters are definitely not the nicest to look at. They all have quite pronounced facial features, leading to faces I've always found a bit uncanny. It's definitely a step up from Twilight Princess, but it's not enough to get a top 5 spot for me. Instead, we find a spin-off up there, as the 5th place goes to Hyrule Warriors. Now, I'm only talking about the original, as Age of Calamity has the same aesthetic as Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, while the original Hyrule Warriors goes for a realistic style, like Twilight Princess, but without the over-the-top grittiness. Since this is of course a Warriors game, it didn't have to account for entire worlds and locales, and could instead focus on the design of characters and enemies. This really paid off, with fantastic designs for Link, Zelda and Ganondorf, as well as other returning characters like Sheik and Impa. Even the original characters like Lana and Linkle have strong designs. It may not be the most stylized game in the series, but it absolutely nailed the realistic look it aimed for. Now we get to the real beauties, with the number 4 position reserved for the GBA top-down Zeldas, the Minish Cap and 4 Swords, both developed by Capcom. Compared to other Nintendo heavy hitters like Mario or Pokemon, Zelda ditched sprite-based games pretty early on, as these two are the final main games to not have a 3D style. It's a complete shame in my opinion, as these games look absolutely gorgeous, while the handheld games that followed can be found at the bottom of the list. 4 Swords already looked good, but the Minish Cap takes the style to the next level and is in my opinion one of the best looking games on the Game Boy Advance. There's so much charm, so much detail, and it's extremely pleasing to the eye. It's without a doubt deserving of this spot on the list. Then it's time to hand out the bronze medal, which is gonna go to Link's Awakening, specifically the remake on Nintendo Switch. The game takes a lot of inspiration from dioramas and looks almost like a set of toys, which suits the small, almost chibi-like models of the game extremely well. Everything has a slight shiny touch to it, making it feel ever so slightly plastic in the best way possible. Every moment of the game looks like it was handcrafted, like a developer carefully placed tiny stop-motion models in front of you. It's genuinely the perfect way to adapt an old Game Boy style game to modern consoles, and I hope the Oracle games will get the same treatment someday. The only reason this game isn't higher up is because I'm not sure I would want an original game in this style. Don't get me wrong, I definitely wouldn't be opposed to it here, but it's especially the translation of the Game Boy original that makes this so special. Time for second place, nothing to scoff at, and it goes to the era of the wild, for lack of a better word. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom and the Warrior spin-off Age of Calamity get to share their silver medal, although I guess it isn't 100% certain this era has completely ended, even if I personally do feel like it has. The art direction of this game feels like another continuation, building off its predecessor Skyward Sword in a way that adds a cel-shaded look to everything and fixes the gripes I had with the character designs. Link looks amazing, Zelda is fantastic, Ganondorf is not my favorite but it's still good, but especially the many races of Hyrule have never looked this good. For almost all of them, as well as many of the enemies, this art style feels like their new definitive design, although I'm sure the next game in the series will change everything up once again. The open world itself is breathtaking and it's an absolutely incredible achievement that both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom may just be the best looking games on Switch. With one being a launch game and the other coming in the Switch's final years, that's an insane feat. But these instant classics have not ended up with the gold medal. And the reason for that is because I still think there's room for improvement with this art style. They got everything out of the Switch they could, they really did, but it was still the Switch, a console which is not as powerful as these games maybe had deserved. Some corners had to be cut to get the whole thing to work, and while that's absolutely understandable, I feel like the number one on this list could barely look any better than it already does. And that game, in my opinion, the one with the best art style in the entire Zelda series, is Wind Waker. While it was initially criticized like crazy for its more childish and colorful tones on the GameCube, opinions have shifted and people have, ironically enough, now matured to see there's nothing inherently childish about colorful designs. And while its fellow GameCube title Twilight Princess hasn't aged the best for me, Wind Waker is the polar opposite. The retouch it got on Wii U was necessary, but this version of the game, now in HD, is touching on perfection from an art style perspective. You could tape two PlayStation 5s together and I still don't think this game would look significantly better than it already does, and that's all because the art style is top notch. The cel-shaded graphics make for a game that resembles a painting, something I'm reminded of every time I sail the Great Sea. Each wave looks like a brushstroke in a traditional Japanese painting, and just like that inspiration, it makes for a timeless look. And don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean I want every Zelda game to look like the Wind Waker. The opposite in fact, because the reason why this game works so well is because the art style fits the content. Wind Waker's adventure isn't dark or serious, it's whimsical, colorful and fun. A more serious story like Twilight Princess or Breath of the Wild wouldn't work with the same style, although I think the Era of the Wild games have definitely been inspired in their look by the Wind Waker. It's a perfect match between game style, story and art design, and that is, at the end of the day, what art design is all about. Making sure the game is presented in the best possible way, and man does the Wind Waker nail that. This has been my ranking of the Legend of Zelda art styles, but I'm very curious to see how you guys would rank the games, so please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed hearing me talk about the Legend of Zelda, please consider liking this video and subscribing, and for now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.